The letter that would nearly get Caroline Hurst killed arrived folded inside a bolt of blue calico, and she read it twice before she understood what it was asking of her. It was the spring of 1881, in the Arizona Territory, in a cattle town called Willow Creek that had grown up along the stage road because there was water there and little else. Caroline was 22 years old, the only child of Deputy Marshal Amos Hurst, and she had grown up watching her father ride out at dawn with his rifle across his saddle and come home after dark smelling of gun oil and trail dust. She had learned to read a man's intentions in the way he held his hands, to load a Colt single-action Army revolver before she could properly braid her own hair, and to keep her mouth shut when the men of the town gathered at the jailhouse to talk about things a deputy's daughter was not supposed to hear. But she had never learned to keep her mouth shut when it mattered most, and that was going to be the trouble of it. The note tucked in the calico was written in a hand she did not recognize, cramped and uneven, as though the writer had composed it in a hurry with a stub of pencil balanced on his knee. It said that a man named Eli Prater, a homesteader Caroline had known her whole life, was being held at a line shack near Devil's Notch Pass, and that if someone did not come for him before the new moon, he would be found dead of thirst or worse, and the blame laid at the feet of Apache raiders who had never touched him at all. It was signed only with the initial R, and it asked plainly for the deputy's daughter to come alone, because the deputy himself was too well known on that stretch of road, and any lawman riding toward the notch would be seen from 3 miles off. Caroline knew, even as she read it, that this was exactly the sort of scheme her father spent his life warning her about. Amos Hurst had buried 2 deputies in the 6 years he had worn the star in Willow Creek, and both of them had died believing themselves clever. He had said to her more than once, over supper, over coffee, over the long silences that came after a hard day, that the worst trap a man could walk into was the one dressed up as a rescue, because it appealed to the very best part of him. She thought of Eli Prater's wife, Margaret, and their 3 children, and the little dry goods debt the Praters had never quite managed to pay off, and how kind they had always been to her mother before her mother died of the fever 2 winters back. She thought about how her father was laid up with a broken collarbone from a fall off a Greenbroke gelding the week before, unable to ride any distance at all, and how the 2 other men wearing badges in Willow Creek were older, slower, and known to every outlaw between there and the Mexican border. And she thought, with the stubbornness that had gotten her whipped by her aunts and admired by her father in equal measure her whole life, that if she did not go, no one would. So on a gray Tuesday morning in April, while her father slept off a dose of laudanum in the back room of the jailhouse, Caroline Hurst saddled her buckskin mare, checked the loads in the revolver she was not supposed to carry outside of town, and rode north toward Devil's Notch Pass, directly into the one thing her father had spent his whole career teaching her to avoid. She told herself, riding out past the last fence line of Willow Creek, that she was not being reckless. She was being necessary. There was a difference, she thought, between foolishness and the kind of bravery nobody wanted to give a woman credit for. She did not yet know how wrong she was about the shape of the danger waiting for her, only that her heart was beating too fast and her hands, when she checked them against the reins, were not quite steady. The land north of Willow Creek rose up in folds of red rock and pale grass, cut through by dry washes that would run flash flood brown if the summer storms ever came early. Devil's Notch was a narrow gap between 2 mesas where the old stage road squeezed down to barely the width of 2 wagons, and it had earned its name honestly, having swallowed at least 4 stagecoaches, and God knew how many riders in the years since the road was cut. Caroline had ridden through it perhaps a dozen times in her life, always with her father, always at a trot, never stopping. She was 3 miles from the notch when she noticed the buzzard circling too low over a stand of scrub oak, and something in her chest went cold and tight the way it did when her father's voice, low and serious, came back to her from 100 different suppers. Anytime the trap looks like an easy path, girl, that is exactly when you had best turn around. She did not turn around. She told herself the buzzards were nothing, coyote kill most likely, and pressed the mare on toward the pass. And that was when the first rifle shot cracked out from the rocks above her and took her hat clean off her head. The mare reared, screaming, and Caroline fought to stay in the saddle as a second shot, and then a third tore up gravel not 2 feet from the horse's forelegs. She caught one glimpse of men on the ridge above the pass, 4 of them, maybe 5, rifles glinting in the flat morning light, and understood in the space of one terrible heartbeat that there was no Eli Prater waiting for her in any line shack, that the letter had been bait, and that she had ridden her horse directly into the center of the snare her father had spent a lifetime teaching her to smell. The mare bolted sideways off the road and down into a dry wash, half falling down the crumbling bank, and Caroline clung to the horn with both hands and prayed in a way she had not prayed since her mother's funeral. Bullets kicked up dust along the lip of the wash above her. She heard men shouting to each other, voices carrying strange and flat across the open ground, one of them calling out something about not letting the girl get clear, and she understood then that this was not meant to frighten her off. It was meant to end her. She might have died there, in that dry wash under the flat Arizona sky, if not for the man who came around the bend of the wash on a rangy sorrel horse at a full gallop, a Winchester rifle already rising to his shoulder. Dexter Fairchild had been 3 years out of Texas, and 2 years out of the war he never talked about, working that spring for the Circle K spread that ran cattle along the base of the mesas north of Willow Creek. He was 26 years old, broad through the shoulders from years of rope work, with sun-weathered skin and pale gray eyes that had seen more than a young man's eyes ought to have seen. He had been riding fence that morning, alone, when the gunfire rolled down out of the pass, and while most sensible men would have put spurs to their horse in the opposite direction, Dexter Fairchild had spent enough of his life running from other men's fights that something in him simply refused to run from this one. He came around the bend of the wash and took in the scene in the space of a single breath. A woman on a spooked buckskin mare, blood on her sleeve from a graze she likely did not yet feel, and 4 men working their way down off the ridge with rifles raised, closing the distance with the unhurried confidence of men who had done this kind of work before. "Get down off that horse and get behind these rocks," Dexter shouted, already swinging out of his own saddle, already levering around into the Winchester's chamber. "Now, ma'am, if you please, because I do not intend to argue about it." Caroline did not argue. She threw herself off the mare and half fell, half scrambled behind the boulder Dexter pointed to, and the mare, freed of its rider, bolted further down the wash out of the line of fire. Dexter dropped to one knee beside the same boulder and began to fire in short, controlled bursts, not wildly, but with the economy of a man who had learned long ago that panic got you killed faster than any bullet did. "There are 5 of them," Caroline said, her voice shaking despite her best effort to steady it. "Maybe more up on the far ridge." "I counted the same," Dexter said, working the rifle's lever, firing again, watching a man on the ridge drop flat behind a boulder rather than take the shot meant for him. "You hurt." "My arm," Caroline said. "It is nothing, a graze." "It is something," Dexter said, "but it will keep for now. Can you shoot?" "Better than most men in this territory," Caroline said, and despite everything, despite the blood soaking warm and slow through her sleeve, there was a flash of her father's stubborn pride in the way she said it. "Good," Dexter said, and drew the second revolver from his belt and pressed it into her hand without hesitation, an act of trust between 2 strangers that would, though neither of them knew it yet, become the first thread of something that would bind their lives together for the rest of their days. "Then make yourself useful, and do not waste a shot on hope. Wait until you have iron sights on something that means you harm." They held the wash for what felt like an hour but was likely closer to 20 minutes, trading fire with the men on the ridge, until one of the outlaws, a lean man in a duster coat that Caroline would later learn to fear the sight of, called down that they had lost the advantage, and it was not worth dying over a girl and a fence rider. And the 5 men mounted and rode off north, toward the broken country that led, eventually, to the border. When the dust settled, and the only sound left was the wind moving through the scrub oak, Dexter Fairchild lowered his rifle, turned to the woman crouched beside him with a stranger's revolver still gripped white-knuckled in her hand, and got his first proper look at her. She was younger than he had guessed in the chaos of the fight, her dark hair come loose from its pins, and hanging in disarray around a face set with more grit than fear. Her eyes a deep hazel that held his gaze without flinching even now, even with blood on her sleeve and death not 5 minutes gone from trying to claim her. "Dexter Fairchild," he said because it seemed the thing to say, and held out his hand as though they had met at a church social rather than a gunfight in a dry wash. "Caroline Hurst," she said, and shook his hand, and felt something pass between their palms that had nothing to do with the danger they had just survived, something warmer and stranger that she would spend the next several weeks trying to convince herself she had imagined. "Hurst," Dexter said slowly, "as in Deputy Amos Hurst." "His daughter," Caroline said, and had the grace to look ashamed of herself. "He told me not to ride out here. He told me it was a trap." "He was right," Dexter said, without unkindness, though there was a plain bluntness to him that Caroline would come to learn was simply his nature. "Might I ask what in the world brought you out here anyway, against your own father's counsel?" Caroline told him then, sitting in the shade of the boulder, while he examined the graze on her arm with hands that were surprisingly gentle for a man who had just been firing a Winchester with cold precision. About the letter hidden in the calico, about Eli Prater and his family, about how she had believed, or told herself she believed, that she was the only one who could go. "There is no line shack holding any Eli Prater," Dexter said, once she had finished, tearing a strip from his own shirt tail to bind her arm. "I would wager my saddle on it. Whoever wrote that letter knew exactly what kind of bait a good heart takes." "You sound as though you know who wrote it," Caroline said. Dexter's jaw tightened, and for a moment the easy competence in his face gave way to something older and harder. "I have my suspicions. There is a man riding this territory who goes by Silas Rourke, though I doubt that is the name his mother gave him. He and his gang have been running cattle across the border, robbing the stage line when the strongbox looks fat enough, and burning out homesteaders who will not sell their claims cheap. Rourke likes to leave a clean story behind him. Apache raiders, road agents, anything but his own name. Your Eli Prater's homestead, if I recall the section maps right, sits on good water at the base of the mesa. That is exactly the kind of ground a man like Rourke would want cleared." Caroline felt something cold settle in her stomach, both at the thought that the Praters might already be in danger from men far worse than the letter had described, and at the deeper realization of how close she had come to dying for nothing at all, for a lie built specifically to use her own decency as a weapon against her. "We have to go back," she said. "My father needs to know." "And the Praters, we will go back," Dexter said, "but not riding hard and careless the way you rode out here, if you will forgive my saying so. Rourke's men may double back once they see we have gone. We will keep to the low ground and take the long way around by Cottonwood Creek." He paused, studying her, and something in his gray eyes softened. "You did well back there, Miss Hurst, held steady with the fear in you plain on your face. That is not a small thing." "You saved my life," Caroline said quietly. "I have not thanked you properly." "There will be time for thanks," Dexter said, helping her to her feet, "once we are somewhere Rourke's rifles cannot reach us." They found her mare grazing calmly a quarter-mile down the wash as though nothing at all had happened, and Dexter's own sorrel had not strayed far either, and the two of them rode together back toward Willow Creek by the long, careful route Dexter had chosen, through country Caroline did not know as well as she knew the direct road, past cottonwoods just beginning to leaf out green along the banks of a creek running low and clear with the last of the winter snowmelt. They did not speak a great deal on that ride, both of them still coming down off the raw edge of the fight. But the silence between them was not an uncomfortable one, and more than once Caroline found herself glancing sideways at the man riding beside her, at the set of his shoulders, at the careful way he watched the country around them without ever seeming to strain at it, and thinking that she had been rescued by exactly the kind of man her father would have approved of. Which struck her as a strange thing to think about a man she had known for less than 2 hours. They reached the edge of Willow Creek as the sun was dropping low and gold over the western mesas, and it was there, at the edge of town, near the split-rail fence of the Hurst place, that Amos Hurst himself came limping out onto the porch with his arms still bound tight against his chest, took one look at his daughter's torn and bloodied sleeve, and went the color of ash. "Caroline," he said, his voice cracking with a fear that had nothing to do with his broken collarbone. "Caroline, what in God's name?" "I am all right, Papa," she said, swinging down from the mare before Dexter could even offer a hand. "I am all right. I was foolish, and it nearly cost me everything, and I am sorrier for it than I have ever been sorry for anything in my life, but I am all right because of him." Amos Hurst's eyes moved past his daughter to the man still mounted on the rangy sorrel, and something like recognition, or at least careful appraisal, passed across his weathered face. "You are the Circle K hand," Amos said. "Fairchild, is it?" "Yes, sir," Dexter said, dismounting, holding his hat respectfully against his chest even as his eyes flicked once more to Caroline, checking on her the way a man checks on something he has decided without quite meaning to, that he cannot afford to lose sight of. "Dexter Fairchild. I came across your daughter in a poor situation out past Devil's Notch. Rourke's men, or men working for him by my reckoning." Amos Hurst's mouth went thin and hard. "Rourke," he said, the name coming out of him like a curse. "I ought to have known that snake would try something like this." He looked at his daughter then, and the fear in his eyes gave way, briefly, to something that looked almost like fury, though Caroline knew it for what it truly was, the particular anger of a parent who has come within a hair's breadth of losing a child and does not yet know what to do with the terror still pounding in his chest. "I told you. I told you plainly, Caroline, that any bait dressed up as mercy was the most dangerous kind there was." "I know, Papa," Caroline said, and her voice broke on the words in a way that surprised her. "I know you told me. I did not listen, and I am so sorry, and I do not have any excuse that would satisfy you because there is no excuse. I only thought of the Praters, and I thought I could not simply do nothing." For a long moment Amos Hurst said nothing at all, only stood there on the porch with his good hand gripping the rail, looking at his daughter as though seeing, all at once, both the little girl he had raised alone since her mother's death and the grown woman she had become, a woman with a will every bit as stubborn as his own and courage that frightened him more than it ever could have comforted him. "We will speak of this at length," he said finally, "once I am certain you are not about to fall down where you stand. But first," he turned to Dexter Fairchild, and something in his posture eased, softened into plain and simple gratitude. "Mr. Fairchild, I do not have the words to properly thank a man for bringing my daughter home to me alive. I am in your debt in a manner I do not know how to repay." "No debt owed, sir," Dexter said. "Any man with a rifle and a conscience would have done the same." "Not any man," Amos said. "Some men would have ridden the other direction and called it good sense." He studied Dexter a moment longer, the careful, measuring look of a lawman sizing up a stranger, and then extended his good hand. "Come in and take supper with us, Mr. Fairchild. It is the least this family can offer." That supper, eaten at a scarred pine table by lamplight while Caroline's arm throbbed dully beneath its makeshift bandage, was the true beginning of everything that followed, though none of them, not Caroline, not Dexter, not even old Amos Hurst with all his years of reading men's intentions, could have said so at the time. Dexter Fairchild spoke little of himself over that meal, deflecting Amos's careful questions about his history with the easy modesty of a man who had learned, somewhere in his past, that talking too freely about oneself rarely led anywhere good. He allowed that he had come west from Texas after the war, that he had worked cattle from the Brazos to the Pecos before drifting into Arizona territory 2 years past, that he had no family left living that he knew of, his mother having died of consumption when he was a boy and his father having been killed at a place called Franklin in Tennessee in the winter of 1864. Fighting in a war Dexter himself had been too young to march off to but old enough, by the time it ended, to have buried a brother lost at Petersburg. He said this last part plainly, without self-pity, the way a man recites facts about weather rather than wounds, but Caroline, watching him across the table, saw something flicker behind his gray eyes and understood that there was a great deal more grief folded up quietly inside this man than he would ever volunteer over a supper table. "You have had hard losses," she said, before she could stop herself, and immediately felt her cheeks color at the boldness of it. "Most men my age have," Dexter said, and there was no bitterness in it, only a kind of weary honesty. "I do not dwell on it. A man who dwells too long on what the war and the years since have taken from him has no room left to notice what good might still be standing in front of him." He did not look at her directly when he said it, but something in the timing of the words made Caroline's heart give a small, unfamiliar lurch, and across the table she noticed her father's eyes narrow thoughtfully, though he said nothing. After supper, Dexter rose to take his leave, saying he had best get back to the Circle K bunkhouse before Wade Calloway, the ranch's foreman, began wondering what had become of him. But at the door, with his hat back on his head and the cool night air coming in off the darkened street, he paused and turned back to Caroline, who had followed him out onto the porch under the pretense of latching the gate behind him. "Miss Hurst," he said, "I would ask you a favor if you will permit it." "Of course," Caroline said. "Do not ride out alone again," Dexter said, "not until this business with Rourke is settled one way or another. I do not say that to scold you, though I imagine your father has already done plenty of that and will likely do more before the night is through. I say it because I would not care to arrive somewhere too late a second time." Caroline looked up at him in the lamplight spilling out from the window behind her, and something about the plain, unpolished sincerity of the request undid the careful composure she had been holding together since the ambush. "I will not," she said softly. "I have learned my lesson, Mr. Fairchild, in the hardest school there is." "Dexter," he said, "if you would call me that. Mr. Fairchild puts me in mind of my schoolmaster, and I did not care for him much." Caroline laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her despite the exhaustion and lingering fear of the day, and the sound of it seemed to please Dexter more than anything else that had happened since he had come around the bend of that dry wash with his rifle rising to his shoulder. "Dexter, then," she said, "and you may call me Caroline." "Caroline," he said, testing the shape of her name in his mouth as though it were something worth savoring, and then he touched the brim of his hat, mounted his sorrel, and rode off into the dark toward the Circle K, leaving Caroline standing at the gate with her heart doing something strange and unfamiliar in her chest. The days that followed were not gentle ones. Amos Hurst, once his fear for his daughter's safety had settled into something closer to ordinary worry, spent a long evening laying out for Caroline exactly what he knew and suspected of Silas Rourke, and it was a grim accounting. Rourke had drifted into the territory some 3 years past, a former cavalry scout dishonorably discharged after an incident involving stolen government mules that had never been properly proven, though everyone who mattered knew the truth of it. He had assembled around himself a loose gang of perhaps a dozen men, drifters and deserters, and a few genuinely dangerous killers among them, and had spent those 3 years building a quiet, patient scheme to acquire the best watered land in the territory through a combination of forged claims, intimidation, and outright murder disguised as the work of raiders or road agents. Eli Prater's homestead, as Dexter had guessed, sat on one of the few reliable year-round springs at the base of the northern mesa, and Rourke had been trying for the better part of a year to force Prater to sell, first through low offers, then through threats, And now, it seemed, through a scheme cruel enough to lure a young woman to her death in order to remove the last obstacle standing between Rourke and a legal claim to the water. "He will not stop with the Praters," Amos said grimly, his collarbone still bound tight, his temper still simmering beneath the surface of every word. "There is talk the railroad survey may run a spur line through this country inside of 2 years' time. Whoever controls the water controls what gets built around it. Rourke means to own this whole stretch of the territory before honest men even understand what is happening to them." "Then we must stop him," Caroline said. "We," Amos said, giving her a hard look, "meaning this office and the marshal's men we can raise from the territorial capital, and not under any circumstance, meaning you riding out alone again." Caroline did not argue, chastened enough by her own near escape to know her father was right. But the fire in her had not gone out, only banked itself down to something steadier and more patient, waiting for a way to be useful that would not require her to be reckless. That way arrived, as it happened, in the person of Dexter Fairchild, who returned to town 3 days later, his arm bandaged where a bullet had grazed him during a skirmish with 2 of Rourke's riders caught cutting fence on Circle K land, and who found himself, almost without meaning to, spending more and more of his rare free hours in the company of the deputy marshal's daughter. Their courtship, if it could be called that in those early weeks, unfolded in small moments stolen between the demands of a dangerous season. Dexter would ride into town on Sunday afternoons, ostensibly to report to Amos Hurst on Rourke's movements observed from Circle K range, and would linger afterward to walk with Caroline along the creek at the edge of town, where the cottonwoods were fully leafed out now, and the water ran cold and clear over smooth stones. He taught her, one such afternoon, how to skip a flat stone across the water laughing outright, a rare and unguarded sound, when her first several attempts sank without a single skip. "You are hopeless at this," he said, grinning. "I can outshoot every man in this territory save perhaps yourself," Caroline said, mock-offended, "and you are laughing at me over a stone." "I would not dare laugh at your shooting," Dexter said. "I have seen it, but your stone skipping wants considerable practice." He showed her the proper angle of the wrist, standing close behind her to guide her arm, and if the lesson took rather longer than strictly necessary, and if neither of them was in any great hurry to step apart once the stone had finally, triumphantly, skipped 4 times across the water, that was a fact neither of them commented upon aloud, though Caroline thought about the warmth of his hand at her wrist for a good while after he had ridden back toward the Circle K that evening. There was a Saturday dance at the Grange Hall in late April, the kind of gathering that drew ranch hands and homesteaders and townsfolk alike from 30 miles in every direction, with a fiddle and a battered piano and tables groaning under the weight of pies brought by every woman in the county hoping to be noticed by someone in particular. Dexter arrived scrubbed and pressed in his one good shirt, and asked Caroline to dance before he had even properly greeted her father, an oversight Amos Hurst chose, with visible effort, to overlook. They danced 3 times that evening, which was enough, by the standards of Willow Creek gossip, to set every tongue in the county wagging, and on the 3rd dance, a slow waltz that the fiddler played with more feeling than skill, Dexter drew her slightly closer than propriety strictly allowed and said, low enough that only she could hear it over the music, "I have been trying to think of a way to say this that does not sound foolish, Caroline, and I have failed at it, so I will simply say it plain. I do not know when it happened, whether it was in that wash with the bullets flying or on some Sunday afternoon by the creek since, but I have come to care for you more than I know rightly what to do with." Caroline's breath caught, and for a moment she could not find any words at all, only felt the warmth of his hand at her waist and the steady, sure rhythm of his heartbeat where her own hand rested against his chest. "I have felt something of the same," she said finally, her voice unsteady, "though I have been telling myself it was merely gratitude because you saved my life, and gratitude is a simpler thing to carry than what I actually feel." And what do you actually feel?" Dexter asked, his gray eyes searching her face with a gentleness that undid her far more thoroughly than any of Rourke's rifles ever could have. "I think," Caroline said slowly, "that I have come to love you, Dexter Fairchild, though we have known each other scarcely a month, and though my father would tell me that is far too little time to know such a thing for certain." "Your father," Dexter said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, "is a wise man in most matters, but I have found that the heart does not always keep to a lawman's careful timetable." He did not kiss her there on the dance floor with half the county watching, but he walked her home beneath a wide sky scattered thick with stars. And at the gate, in the same spot where he had asked her, weeks before, not to ride out alone again, he took her face gently in both his rough, calloused hands and kissed her softly, once, in a way that told Caroline everything her father's careful timetable could not have explained even if he had tried. But the trouble with Silas Rourke had not gone away simply because two young hearts had found each other in the middle of it, and it was only a week after that dance that the danger came roaring back into their lives with a violence that neither of them, for all their growing love, could have fully prepared for. It began with the burning of the Prater homestead. Word reached town at dawn, carried by a half-grown Prater boy on a mule ridden nearly to death, that riders had come in the night, set fire to the barn and the house both, and driven off with most of the cattle, leaving Eli Prater with a broken arm from trying to fight them off, and his wife Margaret with a wound to the shoulder from a stray shot, though thank God none of the children had been harmed. Amos Hurst, his collarbone healed enough now to bear weight, was riding within the hour with every able man he could raise, and Dexter Fairchild, hearing the news at the Circle K, saddled his sorrel and rode hard for town, arriving just as the posse was forming up in front of the jailhouse. Caroline wanted desperately to ride with them, and it took every ounce of her father's patience and Dexter's gentler persuasion to convince her that her place, this time, was in town, tending to Margaret Prater and the children once they were brought in, rather than riding into a fight that would be dangerous enough for armed men without a woman, however skilled with a revolver, complicating the effort. "I am not trying to keep you locked away like some fragile thing," Dexter told her quietly, before he mounted up, "and I know full well you could hold your own out there better than half the men riding with us. But your father needs to know his mind is not divided between the fight ahead and fear for you, and I find I need the same. Let us go do what needs doing and come back to you whole." "You had better come back to me whole," Caroline said, her voice fierce even through the tears standing in her eyes. "Both of you. I have only just found what it means to love a man, Dexter Fairchild, and I will not forgive you if you make me a widow before I am even properly a bride." "I have every intention of marrying you first," Dexter said, with a crooked smile that did not quite hide how much her words had moved him. "So you had best hold me to that, and I will hold myself to coming home." The posse rode out that morning 15 strong, Amos Hurst at their head despite his healing collarbone, Dexter Fairchild among them at his own insistence, and they tracked Rourke's stolen cattle north through the broken country beyond Devil's Notch, following a trail of trampled grass and dropped cartridge casings that led, by late afternoon, to a box canyon where Rourke's gang had made a temporary camp. Confident in the belief that no posse from Willow Creek would dare push that far into country they considered their own, they were wrong about that, and the fight that followed, while brief, was fierce. Rourke's men, caught unprepared with their cattle still being sorted and their horses only half saddled, put up a hard resistance for perhaps 10 minutes before the weight of numbers, and the element of surprise turned decisively against them. 2 of Rourke's men were killed in the exchange of fire, 3 more surrendered outright, and the rest scattered into the broken rocks of the canyon walls, Rourke himself among them, slipping away on a fast horse before the posse could close the ring around him entirely. Dexter took a bullet through the meat of his shoulder in the fighting, a wound serious enough to bleed heavily but not deep enough to strike bone or artery, and it was Amos Hurst himself who bound it tight with a strip of shirt, while the posse gathered the recovered cattle and the 3 surrendered prisoners for the ride back to Willow Creek. "You fought well today, Fairchild," Amos said, as he worked the makeshift bandage tight. "Better than well. I do not say that lightly." "I had good reason to want to come home in one piece," Dexter said, wincing as the bandage pulled tight, and Amos, understanding exactly what reason he meant, allowed himself a small, tired smile. "I noticed," Amos said. "I'm not blind, son, whatever my daughter may think of my ability to see what is happening under my own roof. I have watched the 2 of you these past weeks, and I will tell you plainly, I have no objection to where it seems to be heading, provided you mean to do right by her." "I mean to do nothing less, sir," Dexter said, "if she will have me and if you will give your blessing." "Ask her first," Amos said, "and we will speak of blessings after, but I will say this much now. A man who rides into another man's gunfight to save a stranger, and then rides into it again, a second time even after he has taken a bullet for his trouble, is exactly the kind of man I would want standing beside my daughter for the rest of her days." They rode back into Willow Creek as the sun was setting, the recovered cattle bawling tiredly along the dusty street, the 3 prisoners bound and subdued in the back of a borrowed wagon, and Caroline, who had spent the entire day at Margaret Prater's bedside fighting down her own fear with the work of tending wounds and comforting frightened children, came running the moment she saw the posse's dust on the horizon, her heart in her throat, until she picked out Dexter's familiar shape among the riders. Upright in the saddle, despite the blood staining his shirt dark at the shoulder. "You are hurt," she said, reaching him before he had even fully dismounted, her hands going immediately and without thought to the wound at his shoulder, checking it with the same competent care she had learned watching her father tend his own injuries over the years. "It is not so bad as it looks," Dexter said, though the pallor beneath his sunburned skin told a slightly different story. "Rourke got away, but we broke the back of his gang today. 2 dead, 3 taken, and every head of Prater cattle recovered." "Rourke got away," Caroline repeated, and felt the fear that had been circling in her chest all day sharpen into something colder. "Then this is not finished." "No," Dexter admitted. "It is not finished, but it is a great deal closer to finished than it was this morning." He was proven both right and, in one crucial respect, tragically premature, for Silas Rourke, stripped of most of his men and his stolen cattle both, did not simply slink away across the border as any sensible outlaw might have done. He was, as Amos Hurst had suspected from the very first, a man whose pride had curdled long ago into something closer to madness, and the loss of his gang and his scheme in a single afternoon left him with nothing to lose and a bitter, burning need for vengeance against the family he blamed most directly for his ruin. 2 nights later, with Dexter's shoulder still bound and healing at the Circle K bunkhouse, and Amos Hurst keeping careful watch over the 3 captured outlaws in the Willow Creek jail, while waiting for the territorial marshal to arrive and take custody, Silas Rourke came alone into town under cover of darkness, moving with the patient, silent care of a man who had spent years as a cavalry scout, learning exactly how to move unseen through hostile country. He did not go for Amos Hurst directly, guessing correctly that the deputy marshal would be watchful and armed even in his own home. Instead, he went for the one target he believed would draw Amos out into the open on Rourke's own terms, and force Dexter Fairchild, whom Rourke had come to understand through careful watching was the deputy's daughter's intended, into a decision no man should ever have to make. He took Caroline from her own bedroom window while her father slept 2 rooms away, a hand clamped hard over her mouth before she could so much as cry out, and left behind, pinned to her pillow with a Bowie knife driven through the fabric, a note demanding that Amos Hurst release the 3 captured gang members and bring them, along with whatever gold and cash the Willow Creek Bank held, to the old mission ruins 8 miles east of town by sunrise. Or else the deputy would find his daughter's body left in her place. Amos Hurst discovered the note at first light, and the sound he made upon reading it, A raw, wordless cry of a father's terror brought half the household staff and neighbors running before he had even managed to compose himself enough to speak coherently. Word reached the Circle K within the hour, carried by a young hand riding hard, and Dexter Fairchild, his shoulder wound still angry and only half healed, was in the saddle and racing for town before the messenger had even finished delivering the whole of it. He found Amos Hurst pacing the jailhouse floor like a man half out of his mind, torn between the demands of his badge, which told him a lawman did not simply hand over prisoners to ransom, and the desperate, animal fear of a father whose only child was in the hands of a killer with nothing left to lose. "I cannot give him what he asks," Amos said, his voice raw, when Dexter burst through the door. "If I release those men, Rourke rebuilds his gang within a season, and this whole territory pays the price for years to come. But if I refuse, he will kill her, Dexter. He will kill her, and I will have chosen the law over my own child, and I do not know that I can live with either choice." "You will not have to choose," Dexter said, and there was a coldness in his voice now that Amos had not heard from him before, the particular stillness of a man who had, in another life, learned exactly what it meant to move quietly and decisively against men who thought themselves untouchable. "I know that country around the Mission ruins. I rode fence out that way for the better part of a year before Rourke ever became a name we spoke with dread. There is a way in from the arroyo behind the old bell tower that no man watching the main approach would ever see coming." "You mean to go alone?" Amos said. "I mean to go before sunrise," Dexter said. "While Rourke believes he has hours yet to wait and watch the road you would come in on. You will bring your men and the prisoners and approach openly, exactly as he demands, and draw his attention and whatever few riders he has left toward the front of that mission. And while he is watching the road for you, I will already be inside." Amos Hurst looked at the younger man for a long moment, weighing the wildness of the plan against the plain fact that he could see no better one, and weighing too, perhaps, the particular fierce determination in Dexter Fairchild's face, a look he recognized because he had worn it himself, years ago, the one time in his own life he had loved a woman enough to risk everything for her. "Go," Amos said finally. "Go now before the light comes up any further. And Dexter." He caught the younger man's arm as Dexter turned toward the door. "Bring my daughter home." "I intend to," Dexter said. "And I intend, God willing, to marry her before this month is out, if she will still have a man who nearly got her killed twice over through no fault of her own, but through the sheer bad luck of loving a woman worth fighting for." He rode out alone into the last of the darkness before dawn, his shoulder aching with every stride of the sorrel beneath him, his mind narrowed down to the single, burning purpose of reaching Caroline before Silas Rourke's patience ran out. Caroline, meanwhile, sat bound at wrists and ankles in the ruined nave of the old mission, her back against a crumbling adobe wall that had once, 100 years before, sheltered Franciscan friars and the Tohono O'odham families they had come to convert, and which now sheltered nothing but dust, scorpions, and the bitter remains of a dead man's ambition. She had not slept, had spent the long hours of her captivity working steadily and silently at the rope binding her wrists against the rough edge of a broken stone, and though her wrists were raw and bleeding by the gray hour before dawn, the rope had loosened enough that she believed, with one more hour's work, she might free herself entirely. Rourke had not touched her beyond the initial rough handling of her capture, seeming to understand that she was worth more to him alive and unharmed as leverage than as anything else. But he had made no secret. In the long hours of watching her across the small fire, he allowed himself for warmth against the desert chill, of the depth of the hatred he bore her father, and by extension her. "Your father took everything I built," he said at one point, his voice conversational in a way that frightened Caroline far more than open rage would have. 3 years of careful work, girl. 3 years, and he tore it apart in a single afternoon because he could not simply let honest men take what they wanted from this territory. "Honest men," Caroline said, unable to stop herself despite the danger of provoking him. "Do not burn homesteads and murder families for their water rights." Rourke's face darkened, but before he could respond, one of the two remaining men still riding with him, a nervous young outlaw named Prout who had joined Rourke's gang only that winter and had never quite developed the stomach for the darker parts of the work, called out from where he stood watch at the mission's broken doorway that riders were approaching from the west, right on schedule with the rising sun. Rourke rose, checking the loads in his revolver, and gave Caroline one long, considering look. "Your father is a punctual man," he said. "Let us see if he is also a sensible one." What Rourke did not see, and could not have anticipated, was the shape moving low and silent through the dry arroyo behind the mission's ruined bell tower. A man who had once, in another life, learned to move without sound through country far more hostile than this, and who covered the last 100 yards to the mission's rear wall in a crouching run that left him breathing hard, but utterly unheard by the two outlaws focused entirely on the approaching posse to their front. Dexter came through a gap in the crumbling adobe at the mission's rear just as Amos Hurst's posse, 15 strong and grim-faced, drew up at the edge of rifle range from the front, and Rourke, striding out to meet them with young Prout covering his flank, called out across the open ground with the confidence of a man who believed he still held every card that mattered. "You know what I want, Hurst," Rourke called. "The prisoners and the gold, and you will have your daughter back unharmed. Try anything foolish, and I promise you will not like what comes of it." "Let me see her first," Amos called back, his voice carrying the particular flat calm of a man holding himself together through sheer will. "I will not hand over one thing until I know she is alive and unhurt." It was, though Rourke did not know it, exactly the kind of delay Dexter needed. While Rourke's attention remained fixed on the exchange unfolding at the front of the mission, Dexter slipped through the ruined interior, past crumbling pews and a fallen bell that had not rung in decades, and found Caroline exactly where his gut had told him she would be, bound against the nave wall, her wrists already half free of their rope. Her eyes went wide at the sight of him, and he pressed a finger to his lips, crossing the space between them in 3 quick, silent strides, and going to work on the last of the rope with the small folding knife he kept always in his boot. "You came," she whispered, tears standing thick in her eyes as the rope fell away and her hands came free. "I told you I intended to marry you," Dexter murmured, pulling her briefly, fiercely against him. "I could hardly do that with you still tied up in some outlaw's ruined church. Can you run?" "I can do considerably better than run," Caroline whispered back, and there was enough of her old fire returning to her voice that Dexter felt a fierce swell of pride even in the midst of the danger. "Give me a weapon, Dexter Fairchild, and I will help you finish this." He hesitated only a moment before drawing the second revolver from his belt, the same gesture that had marked the very beginning of their acquaintance in that dry wash weeks before, and pressed it into her hands. "Stay behind me," he said, "and watch the doorway. If Prout or Rourke comes through it before I have dealt with them, you shoot to keep yourself alive and do not hesitate on it." They moved together toward the mission's front archway, and it was there, in the gray light of the desert dawn, that the final reckoning with Sela's Rourke unfolded. Rourke, hearing some small sound of disturbance from within the mission, turned just as Dexter and Caroline emerged into the open, and understood in an instant, with the particular sick clarity of a man watching his last advantage collapse, that his hostage had slipped free, and his enemy had somehow gotten behind him. "Fairchild," Rourke snarled, swinging his revolver toward the doorway, but Dexter was already moving, throwing himself sideways and firing in the same motion, and the shot that followed, echoing flat and final across the mission's ruined courtyard, took Rourke high in the chest and dropped him hard into the dust he had spent 3 bloody years trying to claim as his own. Young Prout, seeing his leader fall and having never possessed much stomach for this kind of violence in the first place, dropped his own revolver into the dirt and threw both hands into the air, calling out in a voice cracked with fear that he surrendered, that he had never wanted any part of hurting the girl, that Rourke had forced him into all of it under threat of his own life. Amos Hurst, watching from where the posse had drawn up, felt the whole terrible weight of the past hours lift off his chest in a single dizzying rush as he saw his daughter standing whole and unharmed in the mission's archway beside the man he had sent to save her. And he was off his horse and running across the open ground before any of his men had even finished processing what had happened. The reunion between father and daughter, there in the dust of the old mission courtyard with the desert sun climbing gold over the eastern mesas, was not a quiet one. Amos Hurst wept without shame as he gathered his daughter into his arms, and Caroline wept just as freely, clinging to her father while the posse secured Prout and confirmed, grimly, that Rourke would trouble the territory no further. But it was the look that passed between Caroline and Dexter, once the immediate chaos had settled, that told the whole rest of the story that mattered. Amos Hurst, stepping back to let his daughter breathe, caught that look, the plain and unguarded love written across both their faces, and felt his own heart, already raw from the fear of the past day, swell with something that was not fear at all. "I believe," Amos said, clearing his throat roughly, "that there was some talk of marriage mentioned to me before you rode out this morning, Fairchild." Dexter, still catching his breath, still smelling of gunpowder and dust, looked from Amos to Caroline and found, despite everything, that he was smiling. "There was," he said, "provided the lady in question is still willing, given how poorly I seem to manage keeping her safe from every direction at once." "You have managed twice now to arrive exactly when I needed you most," Caroline said, closing the distance between them and taking both his hands in hers, heedless of the blood and dust and the watching eyes of half the posse. "I do not require a man who prevents every danger from ever finding me, Dexter Fairchild. I require only a man who will ride toward me rather than away every single time. And that, I have learned in these past weeks, is exactly the kind of man you are." "Then yes," Dexter said. "If your father will give his blessing, and if you will truly have me, then yes, I am asking you plainly, here in the dust of this ruined old mission with the whole territory nearly as witness, will you marry me, Caroline Hurst?" "Yes," Caroline said, laughing through the tears still wet on her cheeks. "Yes, 1,000 times yes, and I would have said it even without the ruined mission for dramatic effect." Amos Hurst, watching his daughter kissed soundly by the man who had twice now saved her life, felt the last of his old caution finally give way entirely to simple, uncomplicated joy. And the posse, rough and weathered men who had ridden hard through the night expecting violence and finding instead a proposal of marriage in its aftermath, let out a ragged cheer that echoed off the old mission walls and startled a pair of doves into flight from the bell tower above. They rode back into Willow Creek together that morning, the recovered outlaw Prout bound in the back of the wagon, the posse in high spirits despite their exhaustion, and Caroline riding close beside Dexter with her hand resting in his the whole way, neither of them willing to let go of the other for even the length of the ride home. The town of Willow Creek, once word of the morning's events had spread, gave itself over to a celebration that lasted well into the evening, part relief at the end of Rourke's long reign of terror over the territory, part sheer delight at the romance that had unfolded in the midst of it. For there is perhaps nothing a frontier town loves more than a story of danger overcome and love hard won at the end of it. Margaret Prater, her shoulders still healing but her spirits considerably lifted, insisted on baking 3 pies for the occasion despite Caroline's protests that she ought to be resting, and the Grange Hall was thrown open again for an impromptu gathering that felt, in its warmth and gratitude, far richer than the formal dance had been weeks before. It was there, amid the fiddle music and the smell of wood smoke and pie, that Amos Hurst rose to speak, his collarbone finally fully healed, his daughter safe beside the man who had saved her, and addressed the gathered town with a plainness that suited him far better than any formal oration could have. "I have spent 6 years wearing this star," he said, "and in that time I have seen this territory suffer under men like Silas Rourke, men who believed that because the law rode slow and the land rode wide, they could simply take whatever they wished and call it their own right. I will not pretend the law has always been fast enough or fair enough to protect every family that has settled this hard country, and I think we do a disservice to the truth if we do not admit as much plainly. The Praters lost a barn, and nearly lost far more than that, because it took too long for anyone wearing a badge to see the pattern Rourke had been weaving for years. That is a debt this territory owes them, and I mean to see the county cover the rebuilding of that barn and house before the summer is out, and I will not hear argument on it." A murmur of agreement, warm and unanimous, moved through the gathered crowd, and Amos continued, his eyes finding his daughter's across the hall. "But I will say this too. My daughter rode into danger against my own express warning, and I have spent every hour since praying I would not lose her for it. And yet I cannot entirely regret the road that led her there, because it is the very same road that brought her to the man standing beside her now, a man who has twice risked his own life for hers without a moment's hesitation, and who has, I believe, earned every bit of the love she offers him in return. There is a lesson in that, I think, for those of us inclined to plan out every step of our lives with careful caution. Sometimes the greatest dangers and the greatest blessings arrive along the very same road, and a body cannot always tell, riding out that morning, which one waits at the end of it." He raised his glass, and the whole hall raised theirs with him, and Dexter Fairchild, standing beside Caroline with her hand held tight in his, felt something settle in his chest that he had not felt fully at ease since long before the war had taken his brother and his boyhood both in the same brutal season. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, on a clear June morning at the small clapboard church at the edge of Willow Creek, with wildflowers gathered from the meadow along Cottonwood Creek, woven through Caroline's dark hair, and Margaret Prater, fully healed now, standing as her matron of honor. Wade Calloway, the Circle K foreman, stood as Dexter's best man, and the whole of Willow Creek turned out to fill the small church and spill out onto the churchyard grass beyond it. For there was not a soul in that town who had not, by now, heard some version of the story of how the deputy's daughter had ridden into an ambush and found, at the far end of it, the man she was meant to spend her life beside. Amos Hurst walked his daughter down the short aisle himself, his collarbone long since healed, his eyes bright with a father's particular mixture of pride and gentle sorrow at giving his only child over to another man's care, though he had, by now, no doubt whatsoever that Dexter Fairchild was exactly the man he would have chosen for her himself, had he been given the choosing of it. "You look exactly like your mother did," Amos murmured to her as they paused at the church door before the final steps down the aisle, "on the day I married her. She would be so proud of you, Caroline. I am so proud of you." "I love you, Papa," Caroline said, her eyes bright with tears she made no effort to hide. "Thank you for teaching me everything you did, even the lessons I was too stubborn to learn until it very nearly cost me my life." "You learned them in the end," Amos said, "which is more than I can say for most men twice your age. Now go on. That young man at the altar has been near fit to jump out of his boots watching you walk toward him." The ceremony itself was simple, as most frontier weddings were, conducted by a circuit preacher who had ridden 3 days to reach Willow Creek for the occasion. But the vows exchanged between Dexter Fairchild and Caroline Hurst carried a weight that everyone present could feel, forged as they had been in gunfire and danger, and the particular clarity that comes to two hearts that have faced death together and found, on the other side of it, that they could not imagine facing anything else apart. "I, Dexter Fairchild, take you, Caroline Hurst, to be my wife," Dexter said, his voice steady despite the emotion plain in his gray eyes, "to ride beside through whatever country this life brings us, gentle or hard. And I promise you now what I have shown you already, that I will always ride toward you and never away for as long as I have breath in me to do it." "I, Caroline Hurst, take you, Dexter Fairchild, to be my husband," Caroline answered, her voice equally steady though tears ran freely down her cheeks. "And I promise that I have learned, at great cost, the value of listening to wisdom offered in love. But I promise you too that I will never stop being the woman who rides toward what needs doing, even when the road looks dangerous, so long as I ride beside you rather than instead of you." The preacher pronounced them married to a swell of cheering from the gathered crowd that startled the horses tied along the churchyard fence, and Dexter kissed his bride there at the altar, with a tenderness that told every soul watching exactly how deeply this frontier romance, born of gunfire and near tragedy, had rooted itself into something that would last the whole of both their lives. They built their home over the following year on a stretch of good land Dexter purchased from Wade Calloway's own holdings at the edge of Circle K Range, close enough to Willow Creek that Caroline could ride in to see her father regularly, close enough to the Praters that Margaret and Caroline became fast, lifelong friends who traded seedlings and recipes, and eventually, advice on raising children born only a season apart. Dexter left the Circle K to run cattle of his own, building slowly and carefully the way he did everything, and within 2 years had assembled a modest but thriving herd that spoke to the same patient competence he had shown that first morning in the dry wash, rifle rising steady to his shoulder against men who had wanted only to see a young woman dead. Amos Hurst, for his part, continued to wear the deputy marshal's star for another 4 years before finally retiring to a small house at the edge of town, close enough to walk to his daughter's homestead of an afternoon, close enough to bounce his grandchildren on his knee and tell them, with considerable embellishment added with each retelling, the story of the morning their mother had ridden into an ambush and found, at the far end of it, the finest man he had ever had the privilege of calling son. For there were grandchildren, in time, 3 of them born over the following 6 years. The first was a boy, born in the spring of 1883, whom Caroline and Dexter named Amos, after the grandfather who had taught his daughter, however painfully learned, the wisdom that ultimately saved her life. He grew up strong and stubborn in equal measure, with his mother's dark hair and his father's steady gray eyes, and by the time he was old enough to sit a horse, he was already following his father out along the fence lines with a fierce and serious determination to learn every single thing there was to know about the land his parents had built together. The second child was a daughter, born 2 years after her brother, whom they named Grace, for the particular mercy both her parents had come to believe had guided Dexter to that dry wash at exactly the moment he was needed, and for the grace with which Caroline had, in the years since, learned to temper her considerable courage with the patience her father had always hoped she would find. Grace grew up with her mother's fierce hazel eyes and a laugh that could be heard clear across the homestead, and she developed, much to her father's proud exasperation, an early and enthusiastic love of horses that rivaled her own mother's at the same age. The third, born in 1887, was another son, named Wade after the Circle K foreman who had stood as Dexter's best man, and who had, in the years since, become something close to an uncle to the whole Fairchild family, having never married himself and having found, in the warmth of Dexter and Caroline's growing household, something like the family he had never otherwise built. Caroline Fairchild, as she had become, never entirely lost the fire that had once sent her riding out against her father's warning into the heart of an ambush, but she learned, over the years of her marriage, exactly the lesson her father had tried so hard to teach her before that terrible ride, and exactly the lesson she herself had spoken of at her own wedding. That courage and wisdom were not opposites, but partners, and that the truest bravery lay not in riding out alone into danger, but in riding always toward the people you loved, and trusting them to ride just as surely toward you. Dexter Fairchild, for his part, never fully lost the quiet watchfulness that had been forged in him first by war, and then by the years of drifting that followed it. But he found, in the years of his marriage to Caroline, that the watchfulness had softened into something gentler, a father's careful attention to the safety of his children, rather than a soldier's grim readiness for the next attack. He taught his sons to ride and to shoot, and to read the weather in the shape of clouds over the mesas, and he taught his daughter, when she was old enough to understand it, the exact story of how he had first seen her mother, crouched behind a boulder in a dry wash with fear plain on her face and a borrowed revolver steady in her hands, and how he had known, even then, in the middle of gunfire and danger, that he had found the one person in the whole wide territory he could not bear to ride away from. On quiet evenings, once the children were down and the cattle settled for the night, Dexter and Caroline would sometimes walk together down to the creek that ran along the edge of their land, the same kind of creek where he had once taught her, clumsily and laughingly, to skip a flat stone across still water, and they would sit together on the bank in the cooling evening air and talk of the long road that had brought them there. From a letter hidden in a bolt of blue calico, to a dry wash full of gunfire, to a ruined mission at dawn, to a small clapboard church filled with the whole of Willow Creek come to witness their vows. "Do you ever think," Caroline asked him once, some 10 years into their marriage, with little Grace's laughter drifting faintly from the direction of the house, about how differently everything might have gone if you had not been riding fence that particular morning? "I think about it more than I let on," Dexter admitted, his arms settled comfortably around her shoulders, the two of them watching the last gold light fade behind the western mesas. "I think about how close a thing it was, and how little separates the life we have built from the one where I simply rode the other direction, or arrived 5 minutes too late, or missed my shot when it mattered most." "But you did not ride the other direction," Caroline said, leaning into him, "and you did not arrive too late, and you have never once in all the years since missed what mattered most." "No," Dexter agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, sun and lavender, and the particular warmth that had come over the years to simply mean home to him. "I have been aiming true at exactly one thing since the morning I found you in that wash, Caroline Fairchild, and I have never once regretted where that aim has led me." They sat together in the gathering dusk, husband and wife, the fierce and stubborn deputy's daughter and the quiet, steady cowboy who had ridden toward danger without hesitation, because something deep and unshakable in him had refused to ride away. And around them the land they had built their life upon stretched wide and golden toward the mesas, watered by the same creek, warmed by the same sun, holding within it the whole unwritten future of the children who would grow up there knowing, whenever they asked, the whole true story of how their parents had found each other, not in spite of the danger that had first brought them together, but somehow, impossibly, because of it, in the particular and lasting way that only the wildest, most unlikely loves ever truly are. And Amos Hurst, watching his grandchildren grow strong and stubborn and loved on land not far from his own quiet retirement, never once regretted, in all the years that followed, that his daughter had once ridden out against his warning into an ambush that should have killed her, for it had instead delivered her, bruised and frightened but very much alive, into the arms of exactly the man the whole of her wild, brave, headstrong heart had been waiting for all along.